thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you to Edward Lovelace for asking me to chair the independent review. I have some experience in biometrics through my work as a barrister, and as already been said, through my work as Deputy Mayor over the last 2 years, where I oversaw the Mayor's data work with the London Data Store. And if you are one of those people, I don't think there are many, but if you're one of those people who follows every single release that comes out from the Mayor's office, you will have seen last week the Mayor has initiated a big new project around using data more effectively. And I'll come to that because we sometimes think of the use of data by public services or public authorities as really being simply the kind of law enforcement paradigm. And we forget that there is an increasing world of benign public bodies using tech to try and find ways to give better delivery, more cost-effective delivery of public services. And they need that guidance to understand how they work within that area, just as much as law enforcement or anybody else needs to understand how they do it in relation to protecting people. But I first worked in this area of law as long ago as 2002, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that before I come to the review. So if you just bear with me, I'll explain a little bit about what I worked on as a very junior barrister in 2002. A 12-year-old boy called, we'll call him S, was bringing a claim against South Yorkshire Police because a change of law a couple of years before the turn of the century had resulted in a change of policy. And the South Yorkshire Police, like most police forces at that time, around the beginning of this century, began retaining DNA samples for everybody who was arrested indefinitely, even children, when they were acquitted of the crime they were accused of, like S. The policy had developed, as many of you will know, because of a horrible crime that had occurred, in which a 66-year-old woman, HB, was raped, and the DNA sample of the rapist had actually been obtained when he was suspected of a burglary, a completely different crime. But the DNA sample, when he was acquitted of the burglary, should have been destroyed and wasn't. And because it wasn't destroyed in breach of the law at the time, they caught him for the horrible rape that he had committed. And that, it could be said, single horrible crime led to a huge transformation in DNA policy. In a short period of time, the UK had developed the largest DNA database in Europe. It included children. It included many people who'd never committed a crime, had just been arrested. And it disproportionately had representation of black and minority ethnic people on that DNA database. So S and another person was bringing a claim challenging that policy about their biometrics. I've got to say, at the time I was working on making submissions on behalf of S, we weren't framing it, we weren't using the language of biometrics in the same way. We were talking about Article 8, thinking we were very cutting edge because the Human Rights Act had just come out. And we challenged it in the High Court and failed, challenged it in the Court of Appeal and failed, challenged it in the House of Lords and failed. And failed badly because the House of Lords said, you're not even engaging, not even touching your Article 8 rights by collecting biometric data like that. You're not even engaged, it's not even a discussion. And what we were trying to do, I remember very vividly, was rely on a report by the Nuffield Foundation about biometric ethics. And we're busy trying to explain to their lordships that biometric ethics is an important aspect of DNA data, and you need to think about that when you're thinking about the rights engaged. We didn't get very far. But S brought his case to the European Court of Human Rights, and the UK government lost in the European Court of Human Rights, and S won. And it's worth noting that the European Court of Human Rights did give sufficient significant weight to the report by the Nuffield Foundation on Bioethics. So maybe that's hopefully a lesson for the future. But interestingly, it wasn't until 2012 that the law in this area really changed with the Protection of Freedoms Act that came in that year. That's 10 years. 10 years from when S started his claim in 2002 till the Protection of Freedoms Act comes in 2012. 10 years during which everybody in this room would appreciate the technology had completely transformed over that period. So by the time you've got the 2012 Act coming in, you're almost in a new world again from that which you were dealing with when the law you were trying to monitor and regulate that had caused S to have his complaint. So, since that, the turn of the century, since 2002, and partly in thanks to the sort of awareness that built up during the course of S's case, an understanding of biometric and what it means to society, biometric data, has developed within the legal context. And there are new forms of biometric data, of course, since then. We understand in law better how we need to regulate the use of fingerprints and DNA. There are emerging forms of biometric data, such as how artificial intelligence analyzes behavior and creates data about you to do with your behavior. That itself is biometric data that would be covered by the Act. It's not simply the chemicals of your body or the genetic material. It's the information that's thought to be unique about you from how your behavior can be represented by data. We also have experience now of how law enforcement and intelligence agencies can effectively gain access to private data sets. We've learned since 2013 in the Edward Snowden revelations how there is a relationship between those who gather data privately and those who need that data to use it for law enforcement and intelligence purposes. So the relationship between private and public data collection, biometric data, is a very important one, and we've seen experience of that. That particular type of relationship remained secret for a long time and became regulated in 2016 by the Investigatory Powers Act. And so we have experience as a country, as a culture, of that sort of use of data and collection of data developing in an almost unregulated space. We have experience of how, as I've said, not only did this country have a permissive culture in allowing a DNA database to develop through its lack of legal regulation, but also we have the largest CCTV coverage in Europe. We have a permissive culture around that kind of data collection. And it's important for us to understand that when we're thinking about what kind of law and regulation do we need. And unlike 2002, we also have, some would argue, if we look internationally, a model of the dangers of governments or societies that have really modelled around a wider use of biometric data to, on the face of it, improve and enhance citizens' lives, but with some aspects of concern that many of us would have if we're not in that particular country from the human rights culture that we may have here. Law and regulation over this period has struggled to keep pace. I think that's a fair analysis. We have, finally, a new EU data regulation, GDPR, a Data Protection Act that goes with it, as we've heard. We have an Information Commissioner whose current iteration of what she does really, although it goes back decades, really was transformed around 2001, 20 years ago, into an Information Commissioner, but has embraced, I think, in a way that has really been impressive in recent years, has embraced the role of regulation over an expanding area of technology. One might be forgiven for thinking the Information Commissioner's brief is one of the most expansive and ever-expanding briefs of any regulator. It's easy to forget that it covers everything from freedom of information through to nuisance calls, and now we're talking about AI and machine learning. The 2012 Act, the Protection of Freedoms Act I spoke about before, that gave us a biometric commissioner. But that biometric commissioner under that act was really there to regulate DNA and fingerprints because of that case, because of S's case, and less to do with the wider implications of biometric data. And has had to adapt to embrace that role. The biometric commissioner, currently Paul Walls, has had to adapt to that role to embrace a wider area. And we have, since 2012, the CCTV Commission. And those are all important regulators in this area. So those roles are there, but because they weren't designed in with a comprehensive legal regulatory overview, and to some extent they emerged to cover different areas at different times which weren't necessarily seen as overlapping, those roles overlap when it comes to something like facial recognition, helpfully in some ways, confusingly in other ways. If you followed the live facial recognition debate in recent weeks and months, you'll have seen all of them have given their view in different ways of what they think is needed for live facial recognition regulation. And we'll also be aware, as of last week, that the Metropolitan Police decision to roll out live facial recognition indicates, it could be said, that even though those regulators may have a view, the police aren't bound to accept that view or follow that view as a matter of strict law. They, of course, will take account of it, but the police are entitled to make their own interpretation of what they think they can do and act accordingly. And so where the regulator, how far the regulator can control that behaviour or limit that behaviour, is still open for debate. Some police forces, like London, like many of you will know, have ethics advisors. So the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime has the London Policing Ethics Panel, which helps with some of these questions. I was lucky enough during my time as Deputy Mayor to sit in on one of those panels, not participate, but watch them in action. They use analogies from bioethics, but they are an emerging and developing area which the ethics panelists themselves are trying to understand the areas at the same speed as scientists and lawyers. So, as far as this review is concerned, I hope I've set out why, after that long history, there is this need for some regulation. In May 2017, the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Justice asked a leading criminal QC in Scotland, John Scott, to chair an advisory group to review policy on the retention of custody images, to review the law on that. And that was because there was a lot of legal challenges developing around custody images, retention of custody images, and the use of them. But in what I would commend as a very forward-thinking move, it was broadened out to establish a human rights framework in the fast-moving area of biometrics. The report was published about 10 months later, in March 2018, and made 9 recommendations. And in May 2019, in accordance with Recommendation 8, the Scottish Government published the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner's Bill after consultation with the UK Biometrics Commissioner. In other words, trying to see what a modern biometrics commissioner would look like, covering a broader role. It's a good example of how review, independent review, government work and collaboration try and pull together to find out how you can help a regulator cover something more comprehensively and more clearly than might have happened if you just imposed it on everybody. That initiative has rightly been widely praised, and in some respect that's part of what we're doing with this review. Unfortunately, the UK's government exercises in this area, I think it could safely be said, have not been quite as impressive as the Scottish government. When it published its biometric strategy in June 2018, I think it's fair to say that it wasn't greeted with a huge amount of enthusiasm from those who had waited 5 years to see what it said. In fairness to those who wrote it, it did talk about, it did summarise existing biometric use and try and set out general principles. But there was little detail. It was almost as if Theresa May's government had been thinking about something else a lot and not this area. And in the couple of years I worked as Deputy Mayor, I became aware for the first time, working for local government of a kind, how those who are delivering public services sometimes don't have a lot of time to think about how they might be delivered. You need other people sometimes to do that thinking for you. And we hope the exercise that we're doing will be part of that. The Common Select Committee made a recommendation for an independent review, and that is the review that we will be doing. I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that review. My time is up, so I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about it in the questions in the panel that's coming. But just to let you know, we have a team that's supporting me on it, all of whom have great experience in this area. I have an advisory group who I'll be consulting. There is a plan that we have of timing which begins with, after some research, taking evidence between April and June with a view to reporting in October. And we will be hoping that many of you who are in this room will be able to assist us with that. Thank you very much.